So a lot of people like to shit on socialism, and I'm okay with that so long as you're using logical arguments. So when I see a meme like this being passed around, I'm likely to respond with something like this. Socialism will never work, except all the times it has. Suddenly an angry squirrel jumps in and asks,
Like when?
Revolutionary Catalonia, Rojava, China is doing quite well, as is Scandinavia with democratic socialism. Old age pensions are socialist. Now here I'm trying to unpack a large idea in 140 characters. Probably not the best examples, but it's what I came up with off the top of my head. They were all successful during their time utilizing various degrees of socialism. And socialist programs are under that blanket of socialism. See, this is where the water gets muddy, because socialism is a very broad term. There's the dictionary definition of socialism, which is a political and economic theory of social organization that advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned and regulated by the community as a whole. Policy or practice based on the political and economic theory of socialism, or in Marxist theory, a transitional social state between the overthrow of capitalism and the realization of communism. It's a bit vague and doesn't really cover the breadth of what socialism entails, but it gets at the heart of it. The community owns the means of production. In a top-down system, the community is represented by a large government, and in a bottom-up system, there's minimalistic governance. Owning the means of production and distribution could be simplified as controlling and allotting wealth. Because of this, communists back in Soviet Russia could claim to be socialist, and so can Sweden. And yes, even old age pensions here at home are a form of working socialism. Socialism is a blanket term, and within it you have a bunch of ideologies that vary quite wildly from one another. Stalin and Lenin are both considered communists, but with very different approaches. So it's hard to nail down socialism to any one particular instance, and to claim it doesn't work in any form is a faulty assertion. And some random jumps in and says,
China is doing quite well indeed, headed toward more capitalism.
Yes, they are adopting more capitalism because it does have its benefits. But if socialism just flat out didn't work, China wouldn't have been able to stay afloat for nearly 70 fucking years. Well, any rational leader would utilize the best aspects of both systems. China's government still technically owns the means of production. The angry squirrel chimes in again with,
Wrong! They are slowly losing that control and realizing that their standard of living and prosperity increases from it. Catalonia failed!
I wouldn't say they are losing control so much as they are relinquishing it, but they'll allow you to run a business, they just still control everything. If they see fit, they can seize your assets. But then again, the government here can also seize your assets so long as they compensate you with an amount they deem fair. And the standard of living thing isn't so cut and dry. It's not like China had the same living conditions as us and then communism ruined it for them. They've been playing catch-up for a long time. Capitalism increases the standard of living for those who can afford it. It decreases the standard of living for those who can't. We have an abundance of food in the West, and yet we throw it in the trash while homeless people have to rely on soup kitchens, which are a socialist program. Abundance means nothing if the excess goes in the trash instead of your mouth. And Catalonia didn't fail because of communism. It was taken by force. So basically, by this guy's standard, something has to last forever or else it doesn't work at all. For as long as Catalonia stood independent, socialism worked as an economic model for them. Hitler could have had his 1,000-year Reich, and when it ended on year 1001, this guy would be like, I told you the Reich wouldn't work!
Scandinavia isn't a country. It is a region. You aren't naming anything that hasn't collapsed due to outside forces or caused the direct deaths of hundreds of millions of people. Mao's great leap forward, like ideological impotence or from famines.
That was poorly worded. But he's claiming that somehow the economics of sharing killed hundreds of millions of people, and not the authoritarian Soviet regimes that took over many communist movements. And this notion ignores the fact that capitalist governments have also become dictatorships in the past. Nothing about capitalism inherently prevents that from happening. So, did socialism starve those people, or the way Mao himself callously went about it? Don't blame Marx's idea for Mao's mistakes.
I can blame his idea because it is a philosophy in which people believe works. When it is implemented, millions die.
Wow, what a huge disconnect. It's like a non sequitur eating itself. The only part of Marxism you can tie to death is Karl's stance on revolution and his implication that the bourgeoisie would never relinquish power willingly. But America fought a very bloody war for independence and then another to keep the Union. Violent revolutions were the name of the game right up until recent history. Marx never said you should starve your population. Nothing about Marxism implies you must hoard the wealth and refuse to distribute it equitably, or that you have to build gulags or execute opposition. None of these things we associate with the Soviets are actually Marxist. Did I say Scandinavia is a country? Nobody mentioned nations. He simply stated socialism itself will never work, and it can if done correctly. Twitter, bud. 140 characters. Scandinavia is shorter than mentioning all the nations I'm clearly referencing. Somehow the entire premise of the debate went over this guy's head. The claim is that socialism doesn't work, and places that identify as democratic socialists have found a good balance that does in fact work. And I contend you are wrong in your assertion that Marxism and not dictatorship is the cause of that death toll.
Democratic socialism in a region means it is controlling its own form of government.
This guy wants to reframe the argument to limit socialism to its most extreme forms and disregard anything in between. For him to say that democratic socialism is simply a region controlling its own form of government is not an accurate depiction. It's about having a democratic government with some regulatory economics and various degrees of control over the means of production, while still encouraging democratic management of business. It's a soft kind of socialism, but socialism nonetheless.
What country has implemented Marxism and not turned into a dictatorship?
That's implemented with an E, apparently. Now, I'm a casual debater. I've got a life to lead, so I usually make a post, then come check if there's a reply later on. This guy, on the other hand, has clearly nothing better to do, because he repeatedly insists I answer him over the course of 20 minutes, as if he's on the edge of his seat awaiting a reply.
Answer the question!
Wow, you actually waited 20 minutes for me to answer while I watch TV? Name a fully Marxist country that US espionage had no part in. Now, admittedly, I should have said capitalist espionage instead of US, because America wasn't the only ones in on stomping out the communists in their fetal stage, but I figure the point still stands. Having a bigger nation constantly trying to undermine your government gives them incentive to become dictatorial. When you have spies sabotaging your economy and attempting to incite an insurgency against you, the easy solution is to abandon democracy, tighten your grip, and become totalitarian in order to maintain control. It'd be like every time you tried to ride a bike, I came and pushed you over, then claimed the bike is to blame. It's no secret that capitalists did everything in their power to undermine communism as a movement. And it's not like capitalists and communists started with an even playing field. Most nations that adopted communism at the time were much poorer and had a lower GDP than Britain or America, even before the revolutions took place. China was a loosely connected bunch of illiterate farmers. Considering that, places like the USSR were doing quite well in their ability to compete as a superpower, and they continued to do so right up until guys like Gorbachev tried to reform things and fucked it up.
Answer the question! What country that has implemented Marxism has not become a dictatorship because of it? Stop dodging! Stop bullshitting!
Notice he's changed the premise from socialism to Marxist country. I already told you, bud, your question is flawed. None of them became dictatorships because of it. You're ignoring all other factors.
It is damn sure not a flawed question. The answer is there are none. Marxism as an ideology creates dictatorships because it sacrifices the rights of individuals in favor of the many. It is by design that it creates them.
He makes it sound as if dictatorships are not a flaw of Marxism, but rather an intended feature. That seems pretty ludicrous. It would be the equivalent to suggesting that capitalism is meant to end in corporate oligarchies. All systems are corruptible, so the charge levied here is moot. Are you familiar with Allemansraten? In places like Sweden, they don't have property rights like they do here, so anyone can travel across your land. They can also camp on it, forage from it, whatever, so long as they aren't legally being a nuisance. This kind of public ownership and freedom of use is a form of socialism that has nothing to do with the means of production, and I haven't heard anyone in Sweden describe it as a dictatorship that suffocates their rights. It's not an ant colony. The only right you're denied is to own, not operate, business, which isn't actually a right here either. People like to exaggerate, especially when they have a horse in the race. He thinks that having community ownership of the means of production is equivalent to slavery to the state, and if it is, then having private ownership of production is slavery to corporate interests. You still have rights to own possessions and personal property. You still have your individual freedoms. You just can't own business capital and milk the resources from it. I like the idea of owning a business, but if it wasn't an option, I'd adapt. And that's not really a right here either. You are allowed to own a business, but you're not entitled to it. Our capitalist government has the right to seize your property at any time for any reason so long as they compensate you as they deem fair, so ownership isn't a right here, it's a privilege. There are plenty of liberties that our government denies us, so socialism isn't worse, it's just different. It focuses on a more cooperative side of human nature, and capitalism more on our competitive side. Again, you're pointing at the bike. Both capitalist and socialist ideas do work if properly regulated. Neither is good in its pure form. Here I'm trying to get him back to the actual topic, whether or not socialism works, not if one is better. He seems to think that there is only one kind of socialism, and that only Soviet-styled communist dictatorship governments are it. And instead of taking in all the factors that led to the fall of these places, like gross mismanagement or totalitarianism, he wants to blame it on socialism, because that's what he's got a raging hate boner for. The perspective of both the communist and capitalist fanboys is that they think their preferred system is some utopia, and that the other is some abject failure. So when Bernie Madoff rips people off with a Ponzi scheme, that's not the drives of capitalism, that was the poor choice of an individual. But when Chairman Mao rips off an entire nation and starves his people, that's not his individual choice. That was socialism's fault. Yeah, real selective viewpoint there. Suddenly another random chimes in and says,
If it, socialism, did work, it never worked without turning into a horror show of totalitarianism.
I replied, true, partially, but do you think that's the result of the economic model itself, or of external forces, i.e. espionage and hostile takeover?
How do you plan an economy without it? You can't have people making their own economic decisions, so of course it's the economic model.
There is still enterprise and profit in Marxism. It's just the workers themselves that own and operate instead of having a single person be the de facto king of the workplace. It doesn't have to be like the USSR where you wait in line to get socks from Big Brother either. Instead, you can still be paid and go out and decide on your own purchases. Even full-blown communists still had marketplaces. And it's a leap in logic to claim that a central planned economy is a direct path to a totalitarian horror show. At its worst, it's just one less liberty. Nothing about controlling the wealth means you have to commit atrocities. When people start getting shot, then I'd agree. But that's the result of a dictatorship and the use of force, not who owns the means of production.
Planned economies always lead to totalitarianism. There has never been an attempt at socialism that hasn't.
Plenty of socialist hippie communes that don't have any gulags or firing squads, and thus far they're viable. At this point, the angry squirrel attempts to drag Sargon of Akkad into the debate. Need reinforcements?
Nah, it's just funny. Sargon is fully aware I am better at written debate than he is.
Well, considering how piss-poor his arguments have been so far, and his inability to correctly interpret my viewpoint, I'd say that's an insult to Sargon. A good Samaritan jumps in and says,
It's more of an issue that you group all socialism in with each other. Having a police department is socialism.
Angry Squirrel replies,
No, that's goods and services. That is a necessity for public order. Defense of a city. Pick a better example.
And here's where logic goes right out the window, and directly onto a hydraulic crane where the cherry picking takes place. Policing is not goods, it's a service. The fact it's a necessity doesn't detract from the fact that it's paid for publicly as a socialist program. It's pretty apt. The police and fire department are publicly funded, thus a socialist program. Pre-1800s fire department, you had to pay out of pocket. Back in the day, the fire department was a capitalist business. They refused to put out the fire in your house if you didn't pay them. And because it was a competitive capitalist business, different fire departments would show up to the blaze and would fight each other for the patronage instead of putting out the fire first. This led to great fires that leveled entire cities, until it was decided that a socially funded fire department was in everybody's best interest. Marcus Licinius Crassus acquired a great fortune by creating the first recorded Roman fire brigade, which extorted money from victims of fire. If they couldn't pay, they let the building burn to the ground, and then bought the property later for a fraction of the price. Back to the main thread, the angry squirrel was going on about how Marxism is inherently linked to atrocities, and I retort, if you were intellectually honest, you would acknowledge that it was the absence of democracy that fucked those places up in the manner you speak of. The economics of shared wealth didn't execute anyone. Suddenly, I notice him retweet my earlier statement, stating,
He tries to dodge my questions of why all Marxist countries are dictatorships. Forgets that North Korea exists.
Well, first of all, the citation of one example is not definitive proof of anything. Secondly, North Korea is not really Marxist by any metric. They don't identify as communists, they operate under an ideology called Juche that promotes self-reliance and isolationism. But they can claim to be Juche or socialist or anything else. It doesn't mean shit if they don't actually fucking do it. I can claim to be a US Marine, but if you found out I've never even been in the military, would you still consider me a Marine? Socialism comes in many forms. Socialism doesn't necessarily mean statism. There is top-down and bottom-up approaches, as I mentioned before. This guy makes no differentiation between the political end and the economic end. I wouldn't say that all Marxist countries are dictatorships so much as some dictatorships are Marxist. As a front, anyway. None of them are really Marxist because Marx believed the proletariats themselves would rule in a stateless society, so there can be no dictator in a true Marxist country. But there are plenty of independent micronations that were socialist and not dictatorships, like Freetown Christiania or Israeli Kibbutzim. And what of times like the Russian Revolution of 1917, in which democratic workers' councils ran things quite efficiently? It again falls on one's definition of Marxist and socialist, as many nations consider themselves Marxist that are democratic socialist, and they are not dictatorships either. He's just moving the goalposts from can socialism work to show me a Marxist country. That's like saying there's never been a spaceship that transported a person to Mars, therefore it's impossible. There will never be a person on Mars. I mean, it took 40 attempts to make WD-40. If this guy was in charge, they would have tried it a couple times then gave up forever.
Sorry guys, WD-2 was a complete failure. If you need to lube up your nuts, just spit on them.
Secondly, North Korea is a special case. Not only are they clearly not Marxist, the whole nation is a vanity experiment of one egomaniacal madman. It doesn't matter what economic system they espoused, the government would have turned into what it is today regardless. I can't imagine any business would want to operate inside the PRNK anyway. Now, I already know there's some dipshit out there saying, no true Scotsman fallacy, but that's not the case. You see, the only reason no true Scotsman is fallacious is because there are no conditions to being a true Scotsman other than being born in Scotland. There are specific conditions to being a Marxist, and if they are not met, then you are not practicing Marxism. So I responded in kind by retweeting his shit and saying, oh, of course, US had no hand in the Korean War or anything. It was Marx, guys. He told Kim Il-sung to start a personality cult.
Korean War was not espionage. The U.S. has not interfered in the North Korean state since a ceasefire was established at the DMZ. Stop lying. The U.S. has not manipulated the growth of that government at all. It has been unimpeached. It has done everything to itself.
No, the Korean War wasn't espionage. It was much worse. If meddling covertly in a nation causes it to become insulated and authoritarian, what do you think overtly attacking it would do? But as I alluded to before, PRNK was going to become the cult nation it is anyway. US had spies in North Korea up until 1996. The CIA helped a coup that failed. North Korea was allies with Russia, whom we fucked with constantly, hence why they, North Korea, became a hermit nation, to keep our spies out and their people in. North Korea is socialist in name only. It's a slave state monarchy. I mean, do you really think our intelligence agencies are spying on our allies and undermining governments all around the globe, but wouldn't fuck with North Korea? A 2016 study showed that America has meddled in 81 foreign elections, and that's just the shit we know about. And which part of a personality cult kleptocratic monarchy was Marxist again?
It's like all you communists are revisionists as well. You people are fucking stupid. That cult of personality was created after your Marxism was in place for 3 decades, you little shit.
Well, according to the link you fucking cited, during those decades of communism they enjoyed a, quote, relatively high standard of living, and they declined after losing their closest Soviet allies and adopting Juche, which, coupled with sanctions, crippled their economy. I'm not a communist, and I never said I preferred communism either. I think a well-regulated capitalism with some socialist elements is superior. I'm just arguing that there are examples of working socialism, and that nothing about the economic model itself is inherently linked to dictatorship. Socialism and capitalism are just two sides of the same fucking coin. This just goes to show that he's not in a debate of ideas. He's not actually reading anything I've said or taken the time to comprehend my position. He's just spewing talking points against a position I never actually took up. Nuance is foreign to people like this. Awesome. So you're conceding that his cult of personality was separate from Marxism? Seeing that one is economic and the other political? And that riding the coattails of Soviets had more to do with the brutality than fair wealth distribution, which North Korea never actually did?
Hey, look! Venezuela is now a socialist paradise. You should go there.
Funny how when I corner him about North Korea, the subject suddenly changes to Venezuela. But I'm glad he brought it up. I'll get to that in a moment. I think you know as well as I do it's no paradise. Oil prices and poor management saw to that. But as usual, you've lost the plot. Never said I like socialism over capitalism. Point is nothing about socialism itself that isn't workable, and capitalism is also flawed. Pretty much every problem there is with socialism, there is an equal and opposite problem in capitalism. One could argue that pooling the wealth makes it alluring for dictators to seize power and control that wealth unscrupulously. But as long as you maintain democracy, that isn't an issue. A dictator can seize power in a capitalism too. Corporate oligarchies and robber barons are the capitalist equivalent. On one hand, you have bread lines that can potentially run out if mismanaged. On the other, you have inflation that makes the bread unaffordable to the lumpen proletariat. As for Venezuela, Chavez was doing well. The country was in a tailspin in the early 90s, but was booming by the 2000s. But something happened. I suppose the success went to his head, and he thought he didn't need to budget anymore. And suddenly the government went on a spending spree, and the debt went from 25 to 120 billion in a short period. That's just bad management. It doesn't matter if you're a capitalist or a communist, you need to budget properly. And oil is 95% of Venezuela's export revenue. When the oil prices tanked, so did the economy. Hugo Chavez failed to diversify, which is the same mistake Carlos Perez made when the state was relying on nationalized oil and steel industries. That's a recession based on bad business planning. Which is a flaw of Marxism I myself point out. Leaders need not only be master politicians but shrewd economists as well. But that's simply a hurdle inherent with a planned economy. It's not possible for the state to run industries that turn a profit. Most communist leaders that come to mind were military strongmen seizing power through a coup. They don't really know shit about economics. We're just so used to incompetent government that we just assume it's always got to be like that. And again, we come back to the definition of socialist, because the vast majority of Venezuela's industries were still privately owned by capitalist elites. Many have accused pro-capitalist anti-Maduro company Empresas Polar of hoarding food in order to fuel dissent. However, the company denies it. After Chavez died, Maduro neglected critical infrastructure like food and medicine in favor of paying off the national debt. It did nothing to help, so they ended up with both skyrocketing inflation and empty store shelves. This is gross mismanagement, which isn't surprising as Maduro has been eroding democratic institutions and seems to be positioning himself to become a Soviet-style ruler. This is the failure of democracy that ruins nations that I alluded to previously. And while all of this was going down, $11 billion just went missing from Venezuela's state-run oil fund. And before you try to blame Marxism, the American government just up and lost $3.1 billion and nobody was held accountable for that either. But it was a bad time to have Venezuela's funds fall into a black hole. So there were a series of fuck-ups that led to the collapse of Venezuela, assuming it can't recover. Admittedly, that is one of the major downsides of a socialist government. They take the financial hits that a corporation normally would, but that alone wouldn't have caused their current crisis. And it's not like capitalism is immune to economic calamity either. Imagine if America's economy was riding on one industry, say, I don't know, the auto industry, and suddenly that industry collapsed and needed a bailout. That would cripple us regardless of who owned the companies. Much like how the banks said if we didn't bail them out, we'd be fucked. And we put it to a vote, the majority of Americans didn't want to bail them out, and guess what? They gave them the fucking bailout anyway. So much for the illusion of free markets and democracy in America.
Get wrecked, you communist faggot!
Get wrecked. Clearly the words of an intellectual powerhouse. Didn't know I was debating a frat boy over here. Reminds me of that eloquent quote by Carl Sagan. Every one of us, in the cosmic perspective, precious. If a human disagrees with you, get wrecked, faggot. As I've said before, I'm not a fucking communist, and that was pretty apparent if this guy would just work on his reading comprehension. I just think it's massively foolhardy to claim that socialism just doesn't work and never will, especially with so few examples to cite. Socialism has worked in various forms for various lengths of time. You can claim there's things about it you don't like, or that there's inefficiencies, but it's dishonest to imply that socialism must be a dictatorial massacre. It's certainly not going to bring about a utopian society, but capitalism has also failed in that department. And instead of citing any actual flaw in the economic model, this guy relies on special pleading and faulty questions meant to build straw men. There is no dialogue here. My position is that both systems have advantages and flaws in different areas, and that the works of Marx and Engels weren't the delusional ravings of madmen. There is some validity to some of the ideas, which have been refined by some of the most astute and influential minds of the 20th century. And his position seems to be that socialism is like a magic Sutter Kane story that makes people evil simply by hearing it. A benevolent, democratically elected leader would read Marx and suddenly become Pol Pot. That's the only possible scenario, guys. And I don't buy this argument that it's just not in human nature. Cooperation is just as much a human nature as greed is, and corruption is a problem for any fucking political or economic system.